Chapter 1. Ellie.
I'm warning you.
Ellie said, her breath faint but visible, puffed out with each word.
If this doesn't work, I'm never talking to you again.
Ellie had been dragging her bedroom mirror from her parents' house for what felt like hours. From late evening to early morning, she carried it deep into the woods behind her backyard. For a grown-up, moving the mirror would have been a minor inconvenience. For 7-year-old Ellie, however, it had been slave labor. And even more so, since she had worked so hard to keep from damaging it. But it would all be worthwhile if Alice's plan worked.
Come on now.
Alice's voice cooed from inside the mirror.
Why would I trick you?
Ellie didn't bother staring into the mirror to read the look on Alice's face. Besides, Alice's regal features would not have revealed her intentions. Momentarily, Ellie's thoughts turned to the darkness around her. Other than a small amount of light spilling from the mirror, Ellie's only source of light was her little blue flashlight, now tucked into her jacket pocket.
Why wouldn't you trick me?
Ellie refocused, still huffing and puffing.
You're always tricking me.
Not today. Today you're going to have breakfast in my father's castle.
Ellie's stomach growled.
Breakfast with the king.
Well, he's not king yet. Nevertheless, you've probably gone far enough.
I'll say,
Ellie replied. She set the mirror against the thick trunk of a nearby tree. The antique piece was surrounded by carven wood inlaid with gold. The mirror was distressed from age and yet timeless. Its elegance was matched only by its weight. Then Ellie sat down on a fallen log a few feet away and faced the mirror. She pulled out her flashlight and looked around. Hours had passed since Ellie last saw car headlights and heard the whooshing and blaring horns of traffic. Now, there was forest as far as the eyes could see. Ellie pointed her flashlight at Alice.
Ow!
Alice said, hiding her eyes from the light.
What is that?
It's a flashlight. Haven't you ever seen a flashlight before?
Well, blow it out. It's too bright.
Ellie clicked off the flashlight, leaving them in darkness.
Well, now I can barely see the mirror. You happy now?
I'll light a candle. How did you extinguish that torch so fast?
I told you, it's not a torch. It's a flashlight.
So, is it magic?
Asked Alice, now visible thanks to the flickering light of a candle.
No, it's an LED with a C battery.
You don't make any sense.
And that's my fault?
Well, now is as good a time as any. Give it a good run-up, now, or it won't work.
Ellie took a deep breath. This is the moment she'd been dreading. Alice's plan was simple. Just run through the mirror and cross worlds.
It'll be easy,
Alice had said.
Okay,
Ellie said, rubbing her hands together. She got up and took several steps away from the mirror, then turned around. She could see Alice through the mirror. Behind her was the dim scene of Alice's lifestyle. A large bedroom with a beautiful 4-poster bed decorated with painted birds. Ellie hoped to be there. She was so close. One act of bravery was the only thing standing between Ellie and a real-life fairy tale.
here goes nothing.
Ellie leaned into a sprint. Her legs pumped. Her sneakers ground against the dirt and grass of the forest floor. Her eyes darted to avoid anything that could tangle her up. At the last moment, she pushed against the ground with both feet and squeezed her hands together like a diver. Eyes closed, Ellie took flight. She wouldn't dare open her eyes until she landed. She could just smell the lovely scents of Alice's bedroom and feel the warmth of the fire in the fireplace. Then she crashed into the surface of the mirror and fell to the ground.
Ow!
Ellie felt at the new bump on her head and blinked back tears. She had landed on the cold ground on her side of the mirror. Alice stood on the other side of the mirror, holding a hand to her mouth, trying not to laugh.
I knew it. You lied to me.
Ellie stood up and stomped at the ground.
There, Ellie. Don't take it so hard. I'm going to bring you to my world. Remember the story I told you about the changeling?
Yes.
Ellie moaned. The pain in her head calmed a little.
There once was a changeling.
You, actually?
Alice said, smiling.
There once was me.
Ellie said. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the distance. Ellie gasped. Her fingers numbly grasped for the flashlight in her pocket. She managed to draw it out, but then it slipped. She fumbled to hold onto it, but couldn't. The flashlight fell to the ground with a clatter. She bent over and picked it up, ignoring the pain in her head, which had just flared up again. Ellie flicked the flashlight on and pointed it in the direction of the noise. There was nothing, only trees to the extent of the light's reach.
Come now, Ellie.
Alice prodded.
Tell me the story.
And I was a fairy's child.
Ellie said, darting the flashlight back and forth. The darkness seemed alive with motion, but anywhere the light fell, there was nothing.
An ugly fairy's child,
Alice corrected. Ellie huffed.
Is that part really necessary?
Then another twig snapped, this time behind her. In a flurry, Ellie turned around and pointed her light at the source of the noise. Again, nothing.
It's essential. Go on.
And then there was a prince.
What kind of prince?
A grand prince who wanted nothing more than a precious daughter.
And that's me,
Alice said. Almost at the same moment, there was a crunching in the distance. Ellie turned around so fast it made her dizzy.
And?
Yes,
Ellie said, now shivering and not from the cold.
but you were born in my world, to my parents.
Ellie heard a distant creak from behind, almost the sound of a dying tree moaning in pain. This time, as Ellie spun around, she could barely breathe from fright.
Alice?
She asked, barely a whisper.
Yes, Ellie. And they loved me very much.
Ellie just kept turning and turning, pointing her light at every apparent movement, only to reveal cold and lonely forest. But snaps and cracks, creaks and groans continued in a rising chorus all around her.
Well, go on, Ellie,
Alice said.
Finish the story.
Ellie's mind whirred. She tried to remember the tale. But why did Alice care so much about the story? Didn't she see the imminent danger?
Here, I'll help. So one day, a puka fairy swept me away and brought me to my kingdom.
And then you lived happily ever after. Now would you please help me?
I am helping you, Ellie. And now a puka is going to bring you here too.
What?
Ellie confronted the mirror. She saw Alice's winning smile, but her flashlight lit the mirror at the right angle to produce a scant reflection. The mirror showed Ellie a picture of herself, arms trembling, eyes wide, tears trickling down her cheeks, and above her she saw a great mass of darkness. Ellie screamed just as a thick woolen bag fell over her face. Fuzzy arms grabbed at her sides.
A fairy?
She tried to inch forward, but was locked in place, held by soft, furry hands.
Achoo.
The woolen bag had soporific sands that swished and swooshed straight into Ellie's nostrils.
Achoo.
After sneezing once more, Ellie yawned.
Yes.
Alice replied. Her voice again gave no sign of alarm or concern.
Or were you requesting a ferry? I can't send a ferry to come get you. I had to send a fairy.
Alice stated matter-of-factly.
His name is Bubbles. I kind of named him myself.
Hey, Ellie.
Bubbles spoke sweetly.
We'll have time to meet and greet later. I'm going to take your lack of screaming as consent to crossworlds, all right?
Ellie felt herself being lifted. She kicked her feet and balled her hands into fists. The creature continued.
Count with me to 3, okay? 1, 2...
Though I suppose I could send a fairy on a ferry, but...
Alice's sing-song words continued until Ellie interrupted her.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Ellie leaned her ear closer to the fairy, stalling.
I lost you on the counting part?
I
only made it to 2.
The fuzzy
send
creature questioned.
A fairy on a ferry.
Alice repeated, speaking over the fairy.
Or were you speaking to Bubbles? Oh, I wouldn't advise that, Ellie. There's no such thing as a nice fairy.
Alice, what kind of trouble did you get us into?
Ellie shrieked, but almost as soon as she finished asking the question, Alice fell silent.
Alice? Alice?
Ellie called. She took in a deep breath to call again for her friend, but instead of shouting, she yawned a second time.
That's strange.
Ellie said, feeling sleepy. After a third yawn, Ellie's arms drooped by her sides, and she fell into a deep sleep. When she woke, Ellie felt the now familiar clutch of the puka's arm suspending her in the air. But she noticed something was different. She felt warmth and the accompanying sound of a fire crackling. She smelled perfumes. Had she crossed worlds? Suddenly, Bubbles dropped Ellie onto a plush carpet.
Oof. What?
Princess Alice!
Alice?
Must be your fault, Ellie.
The puka continued.
I don't suppose you'll get any tumberries for that kind of behavior.
Alice?
Ellie called out, ignoring Bubbles.
Alice, did I make it? I can't see anything. What is the fairy talking about?
Ellie rolled around and wiggled until the woolen bag fell off, and the sandy dust sprinkled onto the floor. She found herself in the opulent bedroom she had seen so many times behind glass. The mighty fireplace with the tapestry hanging against its flue. The intricate dressing table and chair, the thick tufted pillows on the bed. It was all exactly how she imagined it, save for a statue of Alice that she didn't quite remember.
I did make it.
Ellie cried, turning to see the puka with uncloaked eyes. The fairy was tall. He stood about 2 times the size of Ellie without counting his pointy ears. He was bunny-grayed fluffy to boot, with a fuzzy coat of black fur and orange-colored eyes. It was difficult to be scared of the puka, while he paid no mind to Ellie. His orange eyes sat fixated on the statue of Alice, which grew increasingly peculiar.
Alice,
said Ellie, inching closer, but her voice stopped in a gasp. The statue stood beside the dressing table, where Alice stood moments before with her candle. The still-burning candle was now cupped in the hands of the statue. Alice's pretty features, her hair brushed down for the night, and her voluminous nightgown were all frozen in time. Ellie took a step forward and noticed fear in the statue's eyes. The statue was Alice!
Oh no!
Ellie screamed. After a few moments of stunned silence, Ellie stood to her feet, noticing that she held the attention of Bubbles. Ellie made her move. She picked up the woolen bag that once cloaked her eyes and reached out to return it to the fairy.
How do you do?
Ellie put on a nervous smile with a curtsy.
My name is Ellie.
She leaned in.
And your name is Bubbles?
The one and only,
replied the puka with a smile and a slight bow.
Pleased to meet you, Bubbles. We might be cousins, you know. Alice told me my parents are fairies. Do you know them?
Bubbles instinctively turned to Alice first, as if looking for the princess to feed him his next line in a script. When Alice's stone eyes stared back at him, his eyes softened and soaked up. Bubbles glanced back at Ellie and gave a shrug. Ellie sighed. She was back at square one for finding her parents. Of course, she had long supposed Alice could have been making up this story about fairies for parents. Alice did tend to make up stories from time to time. On good days, this was a most entertaining trait. On bad days, you might be left wondering if your parents are gigantic bunny rabbit fairies. Speaking of fairies, it didn't take long for Bubbles to grow on Ellie. A tiny gnat buzzing around the room sent the puka on a chase. Momentarily forgetting Alice's plight, Ellie squealed in delight.
Catch it, Bubbles, catch it!
As Bubbles continued to chase the gnat, Ellie wondered if Alice was playing another trick on her by posing as a magical statue. Soon enough, however, she wasn't sure. The statue of Alice looked too real, too still, and too frightened. Bubbles jumped towards Ellie and drew her in for a hug, distracting her for a moment from the statue.
Ellie?
Bubbles said. Ellie snapped her focus to Bubbles.
I don't know your parents well.
Bubbles broke from the hug and looked down at Ellie, continuing.
But I do know them.
Ellie was speechless for a moment.
They're not fairies, kiddo.
Bubbles smiled sympathetically.
At least not that I know. Actually, they live here in the castle.
The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the fairy. Ellie dashed behind the statue and listened as the doors to Alice's bedchamber swung open and a figure charged into the room.